Well, hello. In our last lecture, we closed when the Continental Congress was about to meet. And remember, it's meeting in response to what Americans called the Intolerable Acts. The Intolerable Acts, which included the 4 coercive acts that Parliament had passed to punish Massachusetts and Boston for the Tea Party, and then it also included the Quebec Act, which was designed to provide administration for what had been Indian Territory. Now it's going to be under the jurisdiction of a British colony, but of all things, the colony that was selected to have all of that territory was Quebec, which was the newest British colony. It had only been a British colony since 1763, when Canada was transferred from French control to British control as a result of Britain's victory in the 7 Years' War. So it's going to meet, and again, it consists of delegates chosen by each of the assemblies. Each of the assemblies chose a group of 4 or 5, probably of their own members, but of prominent people from each colony, and sent them to Philadelphia to meet in this Congress. Now, the first time that the colonists had met in a Congress, only 9 colonies were able to get delegates there. For the Continental Congress, 12 colonies were able to get there, and I have to admit, I don't know which one didn't, but my guess is it was probably Georgia, and I guess that's just because it was the furthest away, and it would be the hardest for them to have us get the news and to get delegates and get them transported up to Philadelphia. And I don't think that anybody was opposed to the idea of meeting. It was just a matter of time and space and opportunity to get things done that prevented one of the colonies from sending delegates. So there are, I don't know how many people there are, but there's, I could say about 4 or 5 from each of the 12 colonies that sent delegations. The makeup of the delegates to the Continental Congress is a big expanse of extremes. From at one end of the spectrum, if you will, are some delegates who were extremely conservative, actually very defensive of the Crown, arguing that what we needed to do is to find ways to resolve the differences between us and England so that we can remain loyal colonies of His Majesty. We can stay firmly in the British Empire and be supportive of the King as we should have been all along. Put an end to all of this radical rioting and so forth, put an end to all of the disruptions, put an end to the breakdown of law and order, defending England's response to the Tea Party, arguing that in fact, of course, the Tea Party represented an illegal destruction of private property, that we should condemn the rioters and support law and order. And that was at one extreme, the sort of the conservative wing. At the opposite extreme were a number of people who have sort of become converts to the idea that we really should start thinking about becoming independent. That idea has been around for a couple of years, ever since the Boston Massacre, when radicals like Sam Adams and Paul Revere were presenting those ideas. At that time, as I told you, almost nobody supported them. In the 4 years that have passed since 1770, more and more of America's leaders have become converts to the cause of independence. More and more people are giving up on England, feeling that the response of Parliament to the Boston Tea Party just shows that the members of Parliament no longer respect us. They're not willing to accept us, and they're not willing to look at our point of view. I think I mentioned before that a lot of people think, one of the sad things is that William Pitt was not around anymore. I think he was still living, but as I told you, he had serious health issues, and so he could not be there. And a lot of people have said that was a tragedy. If William Pitt had been able to go, the things might have been different, that he might have convinced his colleagues that they need to be more considerate of the American position and more accepting of America, more willing to meet some of our needs and answer some of our issues. But there was nobody like that, and the leadership of Parliament was just adamantly against accepting any of the American positions, and so more and more of America's leadership, including now a number of the delegates at Philadelphia in the summer of 1774, at the time of the Continental Congress, more and more are accepting the idea that we're just going to have to bite the bullet and try to achieve our independence. Hard thing to do, because that means leaving what we've always been, British subjects, but there are people who are advocating that. And then there's a lot of people in between. A lot of the delegates are one way or the other, some a little bit more conservative, some a little bit more radical, some of them really undecided, some of them really troubled, not knowing what to do, not happy with what England is doing, but not willing to accept the extreme position of the radicals and advocate for independence. So there's quite a range of opinions there, and there's no clear single idea that anybody has as to what we should do, what the Congress should do. It's very conflicted. But they did a couple of things. They did adopt a resolution paying loyalty to the king, insisting, as they had at in the Stamp Act Congress, that they still respected the king and still hoped that he would intervene and take our side in these disputes. But then they also, sort of at the behest of the radicals, adopted a set of resolutions called the Suffolk Resolves. The Suffolk Resolves. Now, these were a set of resolutions that had been drafted by the town of Suffolk, a town that is now a part of the suburb area of Boston. The local town council was meeting illegally. Remember, under the Government of Massachusetts Act, all local governments had been abolished or shut down. But people were still meeting, and technically they had no legal right to do anything, but they still were doing it. And the town had adopted these resolves. The resolves had in turn been approved by the Assembly for Massachusetts, which also was meeting illegally. As a matter of fact, there was a time when the delegates were in the State House room, the place where they always met, and they were having a meeting, and the governor found out about it and said, wait a minute, they can't meet? This is illegal. The assembly has been suspended. So he sent a couple of his emissaries, a couple of his officials, over to the State House to tell the delegates there, the members of the Massachusetts Assembly, they can't meet. And the Assembly, they just closed the doors and locked them. They locked the doors of the room, and when the representatives of the governor came knocking on the door, the members inside just ignored it. They just went on with their meeting and paid no attention. And so, the governor, he can't do anything. He can't. He's the governor, and he's responsible, and theoretically, the assembly has to have his approval to meet and so forth. And they just do it. He has no power. So the Massachusetts Assembly had approved the Suffolk Resolves, and they had selected delegates to go to the Congress, to the Continental Congress, like the other colonies. And their delegates brought along with them the Suffolk Resolves, which were in turn then adopted by the Congress in a secret meeting. They met secretly. and approved the Suffolk Resolves. The Suffolk Resolves basically suggested that we were not going to get any understanding or support from anybody in Britain. And that, as a matter of fact, the Army, this is the regular Army, now these are the Redcoats who are stationed in Boston and a number of other American cities, are likely to attack us in various ways and militarily take away our rights and our freedom. And that to prepare for that possibility, the Suffolk Resolves recommended that each of the militias in all of the 13 colonies should prepare for the eventuality of war with the Redcoats, with the official British regular army. That the militias should start storing up weapons and ammunition and guns and supplies to be available just in case war should break out. This was to be preparation. It was just to be there as a sort of a last-ditch emergency, but the idea was we were going to need to get ready for the possibility of the regular army attacking our people and depriving us in forceful ways of our liberty, which we take for granted, which we've always had. So the militias started to comply with that. The Suffolk Resolves went out to each of the colonies and to their militias, and some of the militias started to kind of go along with that and to prepare. The colony where the preparations were most seriously advanced, where there was the most work going on, not a surprise, it was Massachusetts. The Massachusetts militia was out gathering up as best they could various armaments. The thing that they needed most of all was gunpowder, because we had to kind of manufacture our own gunpowder, and our opportunities to do that were very limited. So we have limited facilities for manufacturing, so they stepped that up. They worked real hard at getting the manufacturing process for the gunpowder to go. The militia in Boston also actually stole some cannons from the regular army, and that's a long story. The army took them back, and then the militia, or some of the people and some of the radicals in Boston stole them again. So, but that's a long story. But anyway, their preparations, including getting some cannons, because a lot of the militias don't have cannons. They're not that far advanced. They're mostly just foot soldiers. But in Massachusetts, they had a couple of cannons that they stole from the British Army. So they're really getting ready. In the case of Massachusetts especially, Sam Adams is out in the countryside. He had left Boston because he figured correctly that if he stayed there, the army would arrest him and maybe somehow find some way to charge him before the Admiralty Court or do something, or jail him for some reason. So he was out in the countryside working around, working with various units of the militia, and they're getting organized, and they're developing plans of what to do in case the regular army came out after them, which is what the Suffolk Resolves were all about, that the regular army might turn and start attacking us, which meant attacking the militias. So they're developing plans, and they've worked out some elaborate communication plans. It's a kind of thing where if the British Army starts to move, if the regulars start to move, we'll get the news out, and here's how we'll get the news out. And there people are set up who are going to come out and bring the news. and those people are going to talk to, you know, farmers A, B, C, and D or whatever, and A, B, C, and D are going to they're going to send the word to so and so, and those are going to send the word to so and so. They've got it all kind of prepared, how they're all going to communicate, and what they're going to do, and where they're going to meet, and they're just making plans in case the regular army starts to move. Well, on the night of April 18th, as you may know, the regular army did start to move. And by plan, or the word came out that one of the women in town who was supporting the radicals spotted the movement of the soldiers. By plan, she then trapped down Paul Revere, who was still there, and notified him that the army was on the go. It's a little complicated to understand if you don't have a map. You need to understand sort of the geography of the Boston area, which is totally different today. A lot of the area that was then what was called the Back Bay of the Charles River is now all filled in with land. So the geography is quite different today. But there had been a question as to whether the army would go across the Charles River, which would be the closest and easiest way to go, but it would mean getting into boats and crossing the river, or if they would just kind of go around the long way and stay on solid land, and that would be further and longer, but it would be just a direct land route. So you know, those are both possibilities. But what the people who were observing the army noticed was that they were going down to the river and getting in boats and crossing the river, and their goal is to go to, we assumed, and the people who are watching it are having to try to guess what the soldiers are going to do, but the logical guess, which turned out to be correct, was that they were going to go up then on the other side of the river to a little town called Concord, where the militia had stored a lot of the supplies that it had been gathering in pursuant to the Suffolk Resolves. So this woman, and we don't know who it is, but there's it's a long story. It's kind of a fun story. We think it was the wife of the governor. The governor of the colony was General Gage. He was the army man, but he'd been appointed as governor because the city of Boston, or the whole Massachusetts, is sort of under the control of the army since the assembly has been suspended, and so the governor is now the general of the army. And we think that his wife was having an affair with one of the leaders of the radicals, whose name I can't remember, but it was a doctor, it was an MD. And so, so this is a little sidelight to history here, that Mrs. Gage is one of the key people letting the Americans know that the army, which her husband commanded, was out after them. So, but that's a little sidelight there. I don't know if I should bring it up because, you know, it talks about illicit sexual activity there. But people did that in those days. I don't know if you've ever heard, but anyway. But she then, by plan, told Paul Revere. Paul Revere went to the Old North Church, where the sexton, the guy who was in charge of sort of managing and maintaining the church, it'd be like a janitor, but a live-in. The sexton was one of the members of the radical group. Even though the church, this Old North Church, was the largest church in Boston, and it was of all things an Anglican church. Now within Boston, of course, maybe I haven't mentioned enough that there are people in Boston who are definitely supporting the radicals and everything, but there's conservatives in Boston who were opposed to all this radical stuff, very supportive of the king. You know, maybe we would call them loyalists, or sometimes they were called Tories. These are the people who support the king, who support the British rule, who support Governor Gage and so forth. And the loyalists tended to be members of the Anglican Church. And even though this is Boston, was a predominantly still Puritan town, but there certainly were many Anglicans in the community, and their church was Old North Church. So the Old North Church was a center of conservatism, but their employee, the sexton, was one of the members of the radical group. And so the plan was, and this is what happened, that Paul Revere went over and told him, the woman told Paul Revere, he told the sexton, and the sexton, by prearrangement, made a signal. Many of you have heard the poem, but the poem gets it all wrong. But he put up 2 lanterns in the steeple of the church, which was the highest point in Boston. The church is somewhat on a hill, and it's as I said, it's the largest church in town. So he went up there and he put up the 2 lanterns, which was the signal that the army was going to come by sea. They were going to come across the river. And as I said, even that's shorter and quicker. It means that you have to get into a boat, and so that was the downside of that plan. But that was the plan they were going to do. And so he put up that signal, and then people saw that, and then the word went out, and by plan, people started signaling to each other, and the militia then got up, and they started to come down to meet the British Army when it got out of the boats and started heading up on the other side of the river, heading up to the town of Concord. And then they went to the town of Lexington, which is between Boston and Concord and along the way, and some of the militia were gathered there. Now, meanwhile, Paul Revere started to come down and to follow the British Army. So this idea that many of you have heard that Paul Revere goes out telling the Redcoats are coming, the Redcoats are coming. No, he was going to follow the army. And to do that, he had to cross the river too. So he found somebody along the river. By this time, it's like midnight or whatever, 1 in the morning, whatever. But he found somebody who would, a boatman who would row him across the river. And on the other side, he met a friend who loaned him a horse. So he started riding out after the army, just to try to be there and see what else how he could help. And he got arrested. He got too close to the army, and some of the troops arrested him, and they questioned him about what he was doing out there. He made a written account of this, so we know what happened to him, because he, a couple of days later, he wrote down a record of what he had done. I'm kind of intrigued by this. The Americans felt that what they were doing was of historic importance, and they were right, and so they wanted to have a written record of everything that happened. And so they kept a record, and among other things, Revere contributed to that record by putting his personal recollections of what had happened to him. And the main thing he said was that the British Army really mistreated him, the soldiers who had arrested him, and prevented him from really doing anything after he had left Boston. And he notified the section to put up the lights. He didn't see them. He gave the order to put it up. To put up the two lanterns, but he just complained. His written document, which of course is in the archives, most of it deals with his complaining about how the British Army had mistreated him, and they took away his horse, which wasn't even his. He'd borrowed it. And so they took away his horse, and he had to walk back to Boston, and that was the main thing that he reported about his involvement in this whole episode. So, I mean, the poem, which many of you read, from a poetic standpoint, I suppose it's great literature. From a historic standpoint, it gets almost everything wrong. It's totally 100% wrong, but it's a great story. Well, meanwhile, the army is marching on toward Concord. When they got to Lexington, by that time, some of the militiamen had gotten up and gotten out and were down in Lexington to meet the army. and they started shooting at the British soldiers, and the British soldiers started shooting back, and some of them were killed. There were deaths on both sides. And then the army continued its march toward Concord, and by the time they got to Concord, by this time, the whole plan of the Americans has finally fallen into place. It takes a little while for everything to happen, for everybody to get the word out, and for the word to be passed from party A to party B and D and D and C and so forth, on up to Z or whatever. And by this time, a large number of the militiamen have gotten up and are there. And again, there was a clash in Concord between the regular Redcoat Army and the Massachusetts militia. Well, this was referred to, historians call this, and in your book it's referred to as the Battle of Lexington and Concord. April 19th, 1775. This was a real battle. I mean, there were soldiers on both sides. They had guns. They shot at each other. They killed a number of people on both sides. It was a real battle. It marks the beginning of the War for Independence, or as it's sometimes called, the Revolutionary War. It began that night in Lexington and then more drastically in Concord. When the word of the Battle of Lexington and Concord got out throughout the colonies, the various assemblies all decided we've got to do it again. As I mentioned, they've had a sort of a communications network of ways to send messages from one assembly to another. They have procedures for doing that. They have an established sort of what we would today call a communications infrastructure to send the word to another. And they decided we have to have another Congress. So in May, the battle is April 19th. By the end of May, another Continental Congress started meeting in Philadelphia. And we call this now the Second Continental Congress. So the other one now, by default, becomes first. It wasn't called that because they didn't know there'd be a second. When they held it, it was really just the Continental Congress. Now it becomes the First Continental Congress in 1774. Now the Second Continental Congress starts meeting in 1775. And in some ways this is the same as the other two Congresses, the First Continental Congress and the Stamp Act Congress. It consists of people who are chosen by their assemblies. They are chosen as delegates, and they meet together, in this case again in Philadelphia. They met at the same place where the First Continental Congress had met. And it's the same thing. It's people chosen by their assemblies. And I've been trying to use the word delegate. I've been trying to call them the delegates because I don't want to use the word representative. I mean, you could call them that, and oftentimes they are, because they are there to represent their colony. But I want to stick, just as a matter of etymological consistency, I want to call them delegates because I want to reserve the word representative for people who are elected by the people. That's the point. The point of no taxation without representation is that only representatives can tax, and representatives have to be elected by the people. That's what Americans insist on, and I want to stick to that usage just as a matter of terminology here. So I don't want to call these people who are meeting in Philadelphia representatives. I want to call them delegates. And I want to look now at what they did. And on the one hand, they're the same thing. It's that you've got delegates, and they're chosen by their assemblies, and they are there to meet together with delegates from other assemblies and talk about what they're going to do. But this is different. Things are going to change now. We're going to have a sort of a movement or an evolution from, the Stamp Act Congress and the First Continental Congress, and now the Second Continental Congress. and it's going to be different. And I don't want to call it a government. I don't want to make it like a government of the Americans, of the United States. And again, some of this is just trying to be precise about words. I want to use words carefully. You could. I mean, terminology can be used differently, but I want to be precise because I want to stick to certain meanings. And I want to make it clear that this is not exactly a government. Because a government, in order to really do anything, eventually, somehow, has to get money. It comes down to that. Governments can't be governments unless they have money that they can use to do things. Money is crucial, and I'm thinking, without money, you can't really be a government. And the way governments get money, no secret, is by taxing. That's what governments do. Governments tax and get money. They use that money for a wide range of governmental activities. And I hope some of you are kind of seeing where this is going to go, because in order to be able to tax, you have to be able to be representatives. Only representatives can tax, right? That's the way we've worked things out. That's what Americans have been insisting. That was what was there in the Stamp Act Resolves. But it had always been what Americans assumed. That's the way it works. The people elect representatives. The representatives tax. But the people accept this, and they give taxes because the decision to have the taxes are made by their representatives, and so the representatives are acting on their behalf, so they're acting for them, so you're consenting to pay the tax. And that's what's essential. You've got to have consent to taxes. And the way you give consent is through your representatives. As I explained a few minutes ago, the delegates to the Second Continental Congress, like the first, are not representatives. They were not elected by the people. They were elected by their assemblies. Now, the assemblies are elected by the people. So it's sort of close. But Americans don't accept sort of. You've got to be, if you're going to impose taxes, you've got to be elected by the people and become their representative. And that's not the Second Continental Congress. So it could not tax. It could not tax. And so I would insist we can't really call it a government. This is not exactly a government. And we can't say then that the United States is a country with Congress as its government. But in this case, it's a little ambiguous. It's a little complicated here. And you kind of have to look at some things. Because although, on the one hand, the Second Continental Congress was not a government, nevertheless, it did a lot of things that governments do. So, then it becomes kind of complicated here, and you could get into an argument on both sides, or on either side, because, if somebody does something that a government does, doesn't that make you a government? And you kind of go around on that. And as a matter of fact, I hope you'll think about this and make your own conclusions as to whether you want to call it a government or not. And whatever you decide, you're right, because you can go both ways on this. This is a little bit of an ambiguous situation here. So let me now talk about what the Second Continental Congress did, what they're doing, and as you'll see, these are things that I say are things that governments do. First of all, of course, they have to deal with the military situation. A war has begun. And actually there have been not only the Battle of Lexington and Concord, but there's also been another battle up there outside of Boston near Breed's Hill, which is called the Battle of Bunker Hill. That's going to also be taking place right around this time. So, there's a war going on. So the first thing you have to do is you have to get an army. You have to be prepared to fight a war. So Congress established what it called the Continental Army. Now this is going to be an army of the whole continent, meaning just the 13 colonies. This is going to be different from, and in addition to, the militias. Each colony has a militia, so there are 13 militias, but on top of that, and separate from that, is a Continental Army. And the Continental Army is going to get organized. It'll be a little bit tough to organize because most of your, sort of your mainstream, middle-aged, normal military soldier type people, most of them are in the militias. So the people who were in the Continental Army are the people who were not in the militias, and that's kind of a mixed bag. That included a lot of the people who were not property owners in their community. These are the servants or the other workers or the unemployed or the, sort of the leftovers, and there's a certain number of people who sort of don't fit into the mainstream. They're not property owners and they're not part of the sort of the established community. Those guys are all in the militia, but then there's some leftovers. And so those are the people eligible to serve in the Continental Army. Another thing about the Continental Army, they took a lot of kids. Theoretically, you had to be at least 16 to be in the Continental Army. Their rules were that they would only take men who were at least 16, but they had recruiters out there who'd take younger people. So they had the age group of soldiers in the Continental Army was kind of young, since they attracted a lot of young people. And it's sort of a leftover, kind of a grab bag kind of thing of sort of people who were like out of the mainstream because they're not in the militias. The militias are the militias. But they're going to be in the Continental Army. And Congress is going to take responsibility for organizing and maintaining the Continental Army. They also decided to appoint a commanding general, a commander-in-chief for the Continental Army, who will also have authority over the militias. So one of the members of the Congress, one of the guys who'd come, a delegate from Virginia, he'd been coming there to the meetings and sort of kind of a hint. He would come to their meetings wearing his uniform as an officer of the Virginia militia, kind of a, I'm available if anybody wants me. And not a trick question, you all know that was George Washington. So, but it was the Continental Army, the Continental Congress appointed him as commander-in-chief, and they also made him the commander of the 13 militias. So that theoretically, we're going to have a combined army. Something that the British had tried to get the colonies, the militias to do during the 7 Years' War and had failed. Now, Washington is going to have responsibility to have command over all of the militias. He's going to be in command of 14 armies, 13 militias, and the Continental Army itself. And to be honest, it didn't work 100%. He was not 100% successful. He had some of the same problems with the militias that the British officers had had during the 7 Years' War. Members of the militia would not necessarily accept his orders. Their argument was, we get our orders from our assembly, who pays our bills, and we don't know who you are, George Washington. He had a little bit of that, not entirely, it wasn't terrible. It sort of came and went. Sometimes the militias would serve and do what he said, and then other times they'd say, well, wait a minute, we were only here for 6 months, our 6 months are up, so goodbye, we're going back to our farms. He had a little bit of a problem with that. It wasn't as bad as it had been during the 7 Years' War, but his efforts to have a combined army totally under his command were not 100% successful. He had a little bit of success, but it didn't always work. But it was Congress that made the decision that he was the commander-in-chief, And it was Congress that made the decision that all of the militias were to act as a single army under his command. Now we get to, of course, the big question, which I wonder if some of you have been asking yourself, oh yeah, but what about the money? Congress cannot tax. But there were other ways that it managed to find to get money. You might think about what those could be. One of the things that it did was, the easiest thing to do is to print paper money. Now, I haven't talked about paper money up until this time in this class. I don't remember. But it's one of my favorite topics. I like to talk about money. People knew in those days about paper money. Now, real money, as everybody knew, was gold. Maybe you could include silver, but let's just say gold. That's real money. And there's never enough of that around. So people have come up with ways to have paper money in addition to real money, which is gold. And the basic concept is that the process of printing paper money is reserved to certain corporations called banks. Banks are legal entities that have a charter. The Bank of England has had a charter since I think it was 1696 or something. And under that charter, the banks are authorized to issue paper money. They can print up paper money. The catch is they have to have gold, real money, in reserve. So the whole deal is paper money is issued by banks, and it's issued by banks with gold in reserve. The advantage of this is that the bank can issue more paper money. They can issue a greater value of paper money than they have in gold. So that's why banks serve a very important function, because they multiply the money supply. They take X amount of gold, they issue some multiple of that in paper money. But it's only banks that can do that. Well, Congress issued paper money. Now, that's not right. That's not following the rules. Congress cannot issue paper money, not legally. They just did it. Legally, officially, only banks, and banks have charters that limit how much paper money they can issue. Well, this is not a bank, this is Congress. They don't have the right to issue paper money, but they did it. And the paper money that they issued was frankly worth only a fraction of its face value in gold, because everybody knows that this is fake. It's not real money, and so people wouldn't accept it as real money. They would accept it only as a much lower value than if it had been real gold. But Congress did that. Congress issued what's called continental currency, continental dollars. They printed up paper money. And they used that to buy stuff, buy supplies for the army. And nobody wanted to sell it to it because everybody knows the money is fake. But at least that was one of the things they did. Another thing that they did, and this was much more important than printing money, it's not a trick question. If you need money, what do? You borrow it. So Congress relied mostly on borrowed money. They borrowed a lot of money, and they borrowed it from, to simplify things, basically two important sources. One was rich Americans, and one of the keys to the whole Continental Army and to the whole cause of fighting was that a number of the wealthy people in America agreed to lend money to Congress, and that was a big deal. And one of the richest guys in America, a millionaire in Philadelphia, persuaded some of his rich friends to lend money to Congress, and that was sort of a key thing for Congress, was to get all of those loans from rich people. The other source was from foreign countries. Foreigners loaned a lot of money to Congress to keep the war going, especially France, and that was very important. Congress sent a couple of familiar names over to Paris to convince them to lend us money. You know about Ben Franklin, who had long been sort of in and out of France and knew people in France that they knew him. And he was over there borrowing money. And then to assist him, they sent over a guy that you probably heard of, John Adams. He was the lawyer, remember, who had defended the British soldiers after the Boston Massacre. But John Adams worked with Ben Franklin in Paris, and then later Thomas Jefferson came over and sort of took over for Ben Franklin, who went on to other things and was old and whatever. So those are some familiar names. And those guys managed to arrange loans from the French government, from people in France to the cause. We also got money from some Dutch bankers, and that was a key because the timing of that was really crucial. That was a time when things were going badly for the Army and they really needed the money, and then the Dutch bankers came through with a loan that was an absolute savior. We also got money from the Spanish. I'm not sure who else, but anyway, we got several foreign entities loan money, and so between the rich Americans and foreigners, we got a lot of money to help fight the war. And just note here, what Congress is doing is sending like ambassadors to foreign countries to engage in negotiations with those foreign countries. Well, that's a function of government. Governments establish relations with foreign countries, and Congress was doing that. So, you know, it's acting as a government for the United States. And the key thing that those negotiators did was to sign a treaty with France in which France recognized the United States. This is in 1778. War's been going on by this time for a couple of years. 1778, France officially recognized the United States as a country. So, you know, we still don't have a Congress that can tax, but we've got a treaty with a foreign country, and they officially became our ally. And in fact, in the battles that went on after that, the French army was very important in helping Washington and the Continental Army. And the Continental Army, you know, consists of a bunch of sort of loose Americans, just people who don't have anything else to do, and its officers. I mean, George Washington was a capable guy, and he'd been an officer, but he had no formal training in military strategy. He was not a professional soldier, and you know, he was an educated amateur and a smart guy, but he got some help from the French army officials, especially a guy named Pierre Lafayette, and we also got some help from some German officers who came over and provided training to the Continental Army. A Polish officer came over and helped. We had foreigners helping train and educate the Continental Army and the officers and discipline the men, show them how to march and stuff like that. So we got a lot of foreign help, and Congress arranged that. Well, so Congress is doing what a government does. So from a variety of sources, Congress got enough money to fight the war. Let me just I've got a couple other things to talk about that Congress did, but let me just kind of now get to the bottom line here. We had a struggle during the war. The book gives you a lot more information about various battles than I want to get into, so that's part of the book that I don't want to spend time on. I just can't do enough. Don't have enough time here to do everything that I'd like to do. So I'm going to have to leave out a lot of the military battles, but if you read that in the textbook, you'll see that we had a couple of military victories. We had a lot of military losses. We did manage to force the British Army out of Boston, and that was a plus. We tried to force the British Army out of New York. That was one of Washington's main goals. One of his main things was to get the British Army out of New York. He got them out of Boston, but he never was able to get them out of New York. He spent a lot of time and effort doing that and always failed. So, there were some tough times. The Army had never had enough money. Congress would scrounge to get money here, borrow there, get this, get that, put things together. Never enough. Washington could never do what he wanted because he never had enough money, never had enough supplies. It was a struggle, so we never really won. We had some successes, and sometimes we had some ups, and we had some downs. But it turned out that, at the beginning of the war, it looks like it's a no-brainer. England is going to win. They've got a much larger professional army. We've got a bunch of amateurs in the militias and a bunch of less than amateurs in the Continental Army. They have a full navy that they could use for blockade purposes and so forth. We had no navy to match theirs. They had the largest and most successful navy in the world. That's a much larger country. They have a much larger base of population to base their war on. So all of the favors, all of the attitude is that it's a slam dunk victory for the British. And after 6.5 years, when battles have been going on back and forth, the Americans never really could say they won the war, but they were still there. They were still fighting after 6.5 years. And poor old British Army never could deliver a knockout blow. And then on October 19th, 1781, which if you look at the numbers is exactly 6.5 years after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, on October 19th, 1781, there was a big battle at Yorktown, which is in Virginia, and in that battle, a large British army had to surrender to actually a combined French-American army co-commanded by George Washington and his friend Lafayette. By that time, the British public, they've been fighting this war for 6.5 years. They're no closer to winning than when they started. And so there's a lot of public unhappiness in England with the war. Many members of Parliament are getting tired. They've been spending money, thinking, well, let's just get the war over with. We've got them on the ropes, and why don't we just win? And they haven't been able to do that, and so they're finally getting tired of the war. So they finally said, look, when the British Army surrendered at Yorktown, and General Cornwallis had to turn over a very large army under his command to the Americans to become prisoners. And England said, look, let's just start negotiating a peace. So we're eventually going to get the war over, and we didn't, as I say, we didn't really win, but we didn't lose. So for us, that's a plus, the fact that we managed to avoid defeat. Now, I said there's some other things that Congress is going to do, and one of the important ones is that it was Congress that made the decision to declare independence. Now, as I told you, when the war started, we were 13 colonies, and each colony has a militia, and there's tremendous support in America for the king. There always has been. There's tremendous loyalty. There are many people who we can call loyalists or Tories, who continued, even though the war has begun, continued to condemn the war and still support the king. We don't know what the breakdown was between people who supported independence, those who still supported the king. A number that we use, and frankly, the only reason we use this number is because it's kind of nice round numbers, but it's just a flat-out guess, to be honest. But the guess is that a third of the American people favored independence, a third were loyalists and favored remaining in the British Empire, and another third were sort of in between, undecided. But that meant that, you know, for the leaders of Congress, it's really hard to think about declaring independence because you don't know how many of the people really are supporting you. You don't know if you've got public support or not. I made a guess. They don't have any yet. They're just as uninformed as I am about trying to figure out where the American people stand, whether they're really going to get any support. But so they started meeting in May of 1775. They're carrying on this war, and they just don't know what they're really after. They don't know where they're headed. And England is condemning the whole thing, but you don't know what that means. You don't know what that's going to lead to. In January of 1776, a little booklet appeared in this country. It's a little pamphlet written by a guy named Thomas Paine. It's called Common Sense. And in that, Paine argued we should just become independent. It's stupid for the American people, with all of our resources, with all of our leadership, with all of our material comfort, it's stupid that we should continue to be ruled by a little country across the ocean. So he argued that, and we can't tell for sure, but we think that it really was Thomas Paine's common sense that convinced a lot of people, and at least convinced many members of Congress, that it would be okay to proceed and declare independence. So Congress, in June of 1776, appointed a committee consisting of three of its members, Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, and John Adams. They drafted a Declaration of Independence. It was mostly written by Jefferson. And Congress tinkered with it. The committee kind of worked on it, but it was really more the work of Jefferson and the other members of the committee. And Congress made some few changes in it. They modified it a little bit, but basically they adopted it. So basically, the Declaration of Independence was written by Thomas Jefferson. And frankly, it's standard John Locke theory. It basically says the same things that John Locke does. It just says them very well, and it presents the argument that we believe that all people are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. This is what we talk about. Government and government is there established to secure these rights. And if a government no longer does, then the people have a right to revolt, get rid of that government, and replace it with another one that will uphold and protect their rights. And then, frankly, most of the Declaration is a denunciation of the king, saying of all the terrible things he's done to take away their rights. And what Jefferson is doing is trying to convince the Americans to give up their very deep-seated and long-standing devotion to the king by blaming him for all of these terrible things. And Congress then adopted the Declaration of Independence. Well, that was another one of its actions. Well, I want to talk about some more about something else that Congress is going to do, and we'll move on in our next class. The questions for class today are, Why could Congress either be considered or not be considered a government? What are the pros and cons of arguing for Congress as a government? And we'll talk about the whole issue of establishing a government in our next class.